Okay guys, I'm going to start covering chapter 8. A lot of this I already did in that first video I did in front of the whiteboard, but I wanted to make sure you have a better understanding and plus can review some of the names that I might talk about. So China, the first part we're going to just talk about China, and then we'll talk about China's effect on the rest of East Asia, specifically Korea, Japan, and even Vietnam. So after the time of chaos that I mentioned previously, China was revived under the Sui dynasty. As you can see, the Sui dynasty was kind of short-lived. It was just basically a father and son. They reunified China and began the Grand Canal. The Tang would come a little bit later, and the Song would lead it up to the time of the Mongol invasions. What they ended up doing is they built a political system that would last. They used a bureaucracy. In fact, when I think of China, I think of bureaucracy. The exam system, people who work for the government. The exam system became pretty complex, but the cool thing about the exam system is it made it more of a meritocracy, meaning that you could work your way up through the social rank. If you could be named Mandarin, then you were elevated. You had certain rights. You could demand favoritism in products, like for instance taking your clothing to get it tailored. They would push you to the front of the line. Even your parents have to bow to you. You would have the right to be carried in a sedan chair or hold an umbrella. Anyway, the highest people who passed the exam, it was known as Jinshi. And while I'm into this exam, I might as well tell you a little bit more about it. It was taken in like a walled compound, and there were watchtowers of people watching you. You brought in whatever you need. You were assigned a little cubicle, and you'd stay there for as long as it took you to pass the exam, usually around 3 days. So your food, your chamber pot, all was in there with you. Once you left, it was over. So once you passed the highest exams, they move you to the exams at the capital. And if you passed those, your name was announced throughout the empire. You got kind of rock star status. Anyway, golden age of Chinese achievement, what they're talking about is the Grand Canal really allowed for the movement of goods and the subjugation of the South. This led to immense population growth and urbanization. Hangzhou, which was an early capital, had over 1 million people, and it was famous for its marketplaces, as well laid out marketplaces that people could come to from all over to sell their goods. There you see the Jin Empire and the Southern Song. That comes a little bit later, and I'll get into the weaknesses of the Song that allowed northern nomadic people to dominate it. The Tang was one of the largest, which you see in the brown map there. And you can see that little skinny part that goes through the Gobi Desert. And if you're wondering, well, why is it shaped like that? It was to dominate the Silk Road, and that was very important. The Chinese would be the first to use paper money. They also had money that was hollow in the middle that they would keep on strings on their belt. You can see some of the Chinese manufacturing, the fine porcelain, as I mentioned in the first video. And what you see there on the picture on the left is gunpowder. They were the first to invent it. Really, the alchemist who created it was trying to create an elixir for long life. He wanted never to die. And of course, many people were looking for that. But in the end, he ended up creating a destructive force. Women in the Song dynasty. There were certain freedoms, but Neo-Confucianism would make its comeback. The idea of patriarchy. Give way to those above you in the family. And the father was always right. You really didn't question him. You know, the Chinese, when they wrote about women, they often didn't write about important or clever women, like, say, the Indians did. They would write about obedient, diligent women, hardworking women. That was somebody that they admired, somebody who did their duty. Women were seen as weak and distracting, especially for men. And later on, when we get into Islam, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that would lead to the restrictions in the workplace. Foot binding was part of that. It began with a Ming emperor who saw a dancer with tiny feet, and he thought that was pretty attractive. So he ends up courting women with tiny feet, and this spread to the noble class, and it eventually spread to the peasant class. So that what you have to understand is marriages are arranged. If you saw Mulan, and I know a lot of people did, it was my niece's favorite movie, you know there was a marriage broker, usually a woman, and she would help families match up sons and daughters. And they wanted to match up people of the same class, similar social backgrounds. And so they would arrange to have different options for their children. Most of the men would have the options between various women, but the parents of the daughter would have a little bit of influence as well, even though they often had to pay a dowry. But anyway, if you wanted to secure a good marriage, you couldn't have big feet. So mothers would begin binding their daughters' feet as young as the age of 6 by wrapping them in silk cloths. And we'll get to some ugly pictures later. The one picture here you can see is the upper class women with their pet. The other picture you can see women were entertainers. In fact, one of the reasons why women would be educated is because under Confucianism, they're supposed to produce educated sons. And who better to educate their sons than the mothers? All right, so here you see some ugly pictures of foot binding. When you look at them, you say, well, that's certainly not attractive. Well, husbands almost never saw their wives' foot like that. They usually saw them in the slippers. So you see the tiny little slippers. Women were graded on their feet. For instance, I think the highest was a lotus blossom. So if your daughter had lotus blossom feet, which were very, very tiny, which is probably the woman on the far right, then she could demand a better husband, pretty much. By better husband, I don't mean better looking. I mean more financially secure. Anyway, there were still women when I was young that had bound feet, deformed feet. Foot binding pretty much ended in the early 1900s. So when China took over place, especially in the Tang Dynasty, they would demand tribute. Tribute was usually luxury items for the upper classes. You had to acknowledge China's superiority, the idea that China is the middle kingdom. They're the center of the earth. And kowtowing is a series of ritual bowing. You get lower and lower, as you can see in the picture, that just basically says that you are inferior to the person that you're bowing to. So tribute was a good way to manage barbarians. What they would do is they would accept things, especially horses, because the Chinese didn't have a lot of horses. And they wanted to create a cavalry, especially when they saw the great mobility of the northern nomads. Anyway, tribute was a great way to demand subservience. In return, what they would do is they would take the sons of the chiefs of these northern nomads and bring them to the royal court. Sometimes they'd even marry them into Chinese noble families. It was a way to cement alliances. Marriages weren't by love, if you've seen in many of the Disney movies. They were a way to acquire more land or to cement bonds between various peoples. Anyway, the hope was that these sons would be sinified, which means make them Chinese, love Chinese culture. And when they would be returned back to rule after their fathers died, they would be friends of China. So tribute was a great way to manage the various people that surrounded China's neighbors. But as these northern nomads grew strong and the Chinese grew weak, especially during the Song Dynasty, tribute kind of flowed in reverse. Now it was the Chinese who were kind of paying the northern nomads not to attack them or go attack somebody else. They called it gifts. They didn't call it tribute. The Chinese weren't going to say they were no longer the middle kingdom and the dominant people. But they had to kind of recognize that these northern nomadic people, especially once the Jin and various people began to carve out, the Xiongnu and Turkic people, carve out kingdoms in what had traditionally been Chinese-dominated areas. Here you can see the horses coming into China. and the various tribute coming into China. So eventually, you didn't really see the sinification of the northern nomadic people. Why didn't the Mongols become like the Chinese? Well, you couldn't do rice farming or the various types of farming on the steppes, the flat, windswept, arid grasslands of Central Asia. Whereas in southern China, they were more easily sinified. So what you began to see is the Chinese celebrated cavalry and Turkic horsemen, and things like yogurt or coffee drinking or Western style music became very fashionable in the Chinese courts, especially as the Chinese intermarried with these Turkic nomads, mostly during the Tang Dynasty. And eventually this led to a nativist backlash in the South, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, because the South wasn't the traditional Chinese area. But they were the true keepers of the Han. No longer were these northern Chinese true Chinese. They were more like Turks. So they stuck to the tea drinking and the various Chinese traditional music and style of dress. For instance, in the north, they began to wear pants because pants were a little easier to ride horses with, whereas the southern Chinese stuck to the more traditional Han style of dress. All right, so that leads me into Korea and Chinese influence, which is probably another presentation. So I'll stop here and tell you to kind of make sure you read the first part of the chapter, and then when we get into Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, the big thing is who assimilated and who didn't, who resisted, who wanted to be like the Chinese, and who did Chinese rule benefit the most. All right.